Frédéric Chopin, who wrote no symphonies, no operas, and no string quartets, who wrote only for the piano, be considered one of the greatest classical composers of all time?
Chopin didn't just revolutionize piano playing. He's one of probably the most significant composers in the history of music. I mean, he not only rethought the piano, in a way he rethought music. He is one of the most important and personal voices ever.
When you talk about Chopin and the piano, the fact that he wrote almost nothing for anybody else, he wrote a few songs, he wrote a cello sonata, but essentially what he had to say musically could be said by this instrument at this point in its development, because by then it was far beyond the harpsichord ancestry to be an independent instrument with its own range of colors and its own personality.
As the machine was being developed, the machine of the piano was being developed, of course the music that was being written for it was also evolving quite a bit, and Chopin was right there, I think, in the avant-garde, in the forefront of the changes that were going on in the art of music making, while the machine of making the music was also being developed.
Instrument makers and composers have long devoted their lives to creating sounds that capture the range and essence of the most emotional instrument of all, the human voice. From the outset, Chopin incorporated the singing or cantabile style into almost all of his piano compositions.
He really developed the feeling of what it is to sing at the piano. He had an incomparable genius for that.
When Chopin grew up, bel canto opera, the Italian opera, was very much in fashion. And bel canto literally means beautiful singing, and it was all about having a beautiful singing melody line. And he was able to bring that to what was essentially a percussion instrument. Remember that the hammers hit the strings in the piano, and that's a percussive act. But he managed to make that work in terms of a beautiful melodic line, better than anyone had done before. And I think this was a great secret to the individuality of Chopin's music for the keyboard. He essentially sang with the piano.
For those who heard Chopin play, it seemed like the piano was invented for him and he for it. Today, his compositions continue to be performed more than any others for the piano.
I wish we had a composer like that for violin. There's no composer who wrote this way for violin. So many pieces, obviously. One here, one there. Too bad. Oh, well. What can we do, right?
And this raises the question. Since Chopin wrote almost exclusively for the piano and didn't write any major works like symphonies, should he be considered as one of the greatest classical composers of all time?
I suppose that if you're looking at it in the pantheon of great composers, he certainly doesn't have those orchestral masterpieces to put him into that map, so to speak. But if you look at it with the eyes of a composer, if you look at it just as music, I think that Chopin is one of the absolute greatest composers of all time. There's a thread of purity that runs through the history of music, and by that I mean there are a handful of composers whose work is so perfectly calculated that you are never aware of the complexity of the music.
I think it's a fair comment. He didn't write an opera, he didn't write symphonies, but who is more often played at the piano than Chopin? And I think the answer is no one.
Chopin proved that the full scope and range of an orchestra can be experienced from a solo piano. Frédéric Chopin was born in 1810 in a small Polish town near Warsaw. His mother was Polish, his father French. Chopin's incredible talent was apparent at a young age. By the time he was 7, he had already written several pieces. By the ripe old age of 9, he was performing publicly in Warsaw. Like every other European wunderkind who showed great talent on the piano, he was being touted as the new Mozart.
Nobody can really explain how he developed as he did. He had teachers, of course, but largely I think his pianistic imagination was self-taught and self-discovered. He never acquired enough technique to be a virtuoso, and he didn't really have the temperament to be a virtuoso anyway. He wasn't that kind of public performer. So he essentially made the piano a personal voice. And I think that's how he developed as a performer, just learning what he needed to learn about how to play the instrument the way he wanted to play it.
Chopin studied music at the celebrated Warsaw Conservatory. After graduating in 1830, he embarked on a solo tour to find fame and fortune in Europe. While performing in Vienna, he learned of Russia's invasion of Poland. Unable to return home, he went to Paris, where he found himself among thousands of Polish exiles. Chopin decided to stay among them and pursue a career in performing and teaching. Paris's artistic who's who of the 1830s was made up of some of the greatest writers, artists, and composers of the day, including Balzac, Heine, Bellini, Liszt, and Schumann. The frail, sickly, soft-spoken, and elegant Chopin became a favorite of Paris high society.
He lived his musical life in the salons, not in large concert halls. So he was used to an intimate musical environment, and he wrote the kind of music that would work in that environment. So he's not unfairly called the poet of the piano, because he isn't a declaiming orator. He's somebody who speaks intimately, conversationally.
Boy, did that guy have a heart. Talking about romantic stuff. Whew. I'm sure women in the audience were on the floor with every concert. Just their hearts were completely mush at the end of the concert. Every time.
Despite his newfound popularity and success, Chopin was extremely homesick. He was known to carry a small container of Polish soil with him at all times. He filled his music with the sounds of his native land, introducing traditional polonaises and mazurkas to Western Europe.
I've sometimes said that Russians are only truly happy when they're sad. And Poles, I think, are never truly happy unless they're nostalgic. There's a little bit of Poland always that goes with them. And I think you hear Poland in his music, in Chopin's music.
Chopin wanted to assert his Polishness, and he picked up native forms. He picked up the mazurka and the polonaise, which were traditional dances. But he basically turned them into art forms. I mean, where they were originally intended to be danced to, it would be pretty difficult to dance to one of Chopin's polonaises. He refined the rhythmic structure, he refined its harmonic structure. He gave the piece an overall structure which was much more elaborate than the original.
It's sometimes not realized that Chopin was one of the great harmonic innovators of the 19th century. That in fact he moved from key to key in a way that surprised a lot of his contemporaries.
Chopin was thought of as wild and nuts, and his rhythms didn't work. I mean, some of the critics accused him of that. And yet, you know, with hindsight now, we see him as a logical outgrowth of Romanticism.
And Chopin personalized that romantic movement by bringing the whole concept of romance and the hero's struggle down to just himself at the keyboard. He toured Europe as a piano virtuoso. He wrote pieces for himself that contained enormously difficult technical accomplishments, in addition to the most profound poetry that had then been heard on the piano, Beethoven included.
Another thing that also astonished his contemporaries was how he varied the traditional roles of the left and right hands. The D-flat major prelude is a good example of this. The left hand begins with the raindrop accompaniment, while the right hand carries the melody. Note how a few bars in, they switch. Here's the switch. In 1838, romance came into Chopin's life when he met Georges Sand. She was a female author who used a male pen name to boost sales of her risque novels. Her real name was Baroness Aurore Dudevant. She was 6 years older than Chopin. After their first meeting, Chopin remarked, "I have met a great celebrity, Madame Dudevant, known as Georges Sand. Her appearance is not to my liking. Indeed, there is something about her which positively repels me. What an unattractive person La Sand is. Is she really a woman? I'm inclined to doubt it."
The relationship with Georges Sand has been written about a great deal, about their romantic trysts, and especially in the last days when she nursed him. It was obviously a very strong bond between them, but she quite literally wore the pants in the family. And she was a dominating personality, and I think to a certain extent he needed that. He was somebody who wasn't all that assertive himself as a person. So I think that she was good for him not only in a maternal sense, but also in a creative sense. That the relationship fostered a kind of outpouring of music as he was feeling an outpouring of love. So although there were certainly hurdles in the relationship, it turned out to be not only beneficial on human level, but beneficial on a creative one.
After their breakup, Chopin sank into depression and his health deteriorated. 2 years later, he finally succumbed to his 12-year battle with tuberculosis. He was only 39. More than 3,000 people attended his funeral at Paris's famous Madeleine Church. The container of Polish soil he carried so religiously in his pocket was poured over his coffin. One of Chopin's final requests was that his sister return his heart to Poland. It was placed in an urn and entombed in a church's pillar in Warsaw. Chopin was a master of short forms. He had popularized his native polonaises and mazurkas and was known for the brilliance of his etudes and preludes. But it is Chopin's nocturnes that will be forever synonymous with his name. As their title suggests, they are dreamy night pieces with melodies many people consider among the most beautiful ever written.
I think the suppleness and the flexibility you can achieve in Chopin nocturnes come from the fact that you think in a romantic spirit, but you play, also a little bit maintaining a certain classical balance and ideal. And then the mix is simply magic.
There used to be a classical definition of music as the organization of sound toward beauty. And I think Chopin really embodies that definition very well. He was after a beautiful effect in whatever he wrote, whether a full-length concerto or a tiny mazurka. And I think that he charmed everybody. The music just was so lovely to listen to, and it just sang its way into the heart. That was true in his day, and it hasn't stopped being true for our own. I think as long as people want to listen to music, they're going to be listening to Chopin.